Hey, Village Church, Pastor Mark here. It has been a really sad, frustrating week in light of the death of George Floyd and also a couple weeks ago with Ahmaud Arbery, and recognizing that racism is alive and well in the world, and whether you're someone on the left or the right politically around these things and how you interpret the data. And I see people online getting frustrated one way or the other about all the details of these kind of cases and debating this fact and that fact and whatever. The reality is at 30,000 feet, it's really clear biblically that racism is an abhorrent sin in the eyes of God. He hates it. And it's funny, you talk to I was talking with my Black pastor friends down in the States, and even listening to their experience of this and recognizing that their experience has been that so often the church, when you get up and speak about sin, lust, greed, adultery, it's, amen, let's go, let's talk about it, no problems. And then when you talk about race, immediately it's put into some kind of political category where you're not allowed to talk about it. And pastors often fear to speak out about it in the U.S., especially. In the U.S. experience is a little different than the Canadian one around these things. They have their unique experiences and we have ours, but it's still very relevant and serious here in Canada as well. But you have this fear to speak out about these things or to talk about them. And you realize that the church really kind of picks and chooses its sins sometimes. But this is clearly a sin. And in Galatians 2, actually, Paul points out something that's really important for us to understand. He's calling out a kind of racism in the Apostle Peter, who was hanging out with Jews and Gentiles at table and having life together. And then some Jews from Jerusalem, Paul says, came and applied this kind of social pressure on him, and he broke table fellowship with the Gentiles. And Paul says that sin, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. This is Galatians 2, verse 11, because he stood condemned. And then he says that the reason was when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. So he says that not only is racism a sin, which of course it is, but it's actually the root of it is a misunderstanding of the gospel. That when you and I, aside from whatever side you choose on these issues politically, aside from any of that narrative that we try to put these kind of stories in order to make sense of them, aside from all of that, and even aside from one case versus another case, this is an issue of understanding the gospel. That if you're a Christian and you really believe the gospel, then there is no room for racism in our hearts, in our lives, in our experience at all, to any race. And so when we begin to feel ourselves going down that road, we're literally fighting against the gospel. We're fighting against heaven. The experience of heaven, according to Revelation 5, is worshiping the Lamb, every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so when we experience that in our lives or act out on it or believe it, even in the deepest recesses of our soul, we got to fight against it, because you're literally saying that I know a better way or I feel a better way than heaven itself and the experience of that glory and the way it's going to be. So yes, it's a sin issue, but it's also a misunderstanding of the gospel, which of course brings reconciliation of all people and allows the whole color plethora of every tribe, tongue, nation, ethnicity worship Jesus, and the church is one global transnational people. And that's a beautiful thing. I remember when I worked at a church in Toronto, there was over 70 different nations represented in that church. And literally Sunday morning felt like Revelation 5. It was like every ethnicity. It was beautiful. My whole youth group was just multi-ethnic, and it was just an unbelievable reality. Living and doing ministry in Scarborough for years, in Toronto, one of the most multi-ethnic cities in the world, and seeing how the gospel cuts across all that and calls us to be one church was a beautiful thing. Now, The thing that people are careful about in these scenarios, and I understand that, is for this not to become a anti-police, anti-first responders thing. And I agree with that. And the first responders and police that I know and talk to and love dearly, they share the same frustration as everyone else does. In fact, they got into that job, many of them, to fight for justice, not destabilize it. And so they also go, hey, look, we weren't trained that way, or we're not supposed to act that way. We actually got into this to help all races, all people. And so this really isn't some kind of push against that. There's a respect for the work that they do. But you can have that respect as a person and still really push back against the abuse of power. And that's with any position, including pastoral positions or any kind of leadership position, politics, or whatever it is. We need to be able to say, hey, look, there was an actual abuse of power in this scenario. We want to talk about it, and that be okay, and that the conversation wouldn't be silenced. But really, at the end of the day, there's a sadness here. We just talked to our oldest daughter about this because, obviously you can't get away from it, and her experience of it, and seeing it, and then asking, what is this about? And us, really have to, it's a really strange experience to have to kind of go back and explain racism and explain where it takes root in the heart and the mind, and why people would view other races in this way or that. And literally, she's crying. There's tears running down her face, trying to process this in her brain of why human beings would think like this or act like this and whatever. And it's to really kind of step back and see that effect in the soul, and to realize that in many ways this is taught and it's caught, and that's partly the church's job, is to pray and fight and work for the kingdom come, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This isn't, when we're talking about stuff that we've talked about as a church often, fighting for the quartet of the vulnerable, going for the orphans and the widows and the marginalized and those without a voice, and the work we've done since the beginning of our church on a local mission level and on a global mission level has always been about that very fight for, whatever we can do in our moment with our resources and our platform, however big or small that is, to be able to help in some way and speak into that. And I hope that you, in whatever capacity you can, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or an entrepreneur or a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or whatever you do in life, that whatever your context is, that you would make the kingdom come and God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven in regard to this issue in whatever sphere you've got. And that's what we're all called to do. And so pray into that. Pray for our brothers and sisters down in the U.S. I was just talking to my pastor friend down there, and he's just like, this is just, it's so hard to watch this and the reactions and now the riots and all these things going on. What's the job of the church? Pray, live and work for the kingdom to come in justice, and not hide from it, to recognize it's a gospel issue and a Bible issue and not a political or an ideological one, and to humbly look inward constantly. How is the gospel working on you in your life? And living for the multi-ethnic church of the world, and to realize that that's the plan of God. This is the beauty. People are made with an inherent value. Every tribe, tongue is made in the image of God. We literally have a worldview that makes us go, every human being, no matter what race, is made in the image of God and has value and is totally equal in the eyes of God and people. And that's the value, and they're loved, and we should live and fight for that reality, and not be afraid of that. And so our worldview, the beautiful worldview of the Bible and Jesus, actually gives us that. There are some worldviews that wouldn't necessarily tell that story and narrative about people, but beautifully the Bible does. And so we need to live into that at this moment, Village Church. We need to pray, we need to fast, and we need to do whatever God has called us to do in our capacity to love and serve Him and these people the best we can. So love you guys. Keep praying.